Welcome, everyone. My name is Fabiola Cordova. I'm an Associate Director for Latin America and the Caribbean here at the National Endowment for Democracy. And on behalf of the NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, The End of an Era, Bolivia's Evo Morales and the Alternation of Power. I think it's a little loud, maybe. Sorry. Featuring Reagan Facel Democracy Fellow Raul Peñaranda. We are delighted to have with us as a discussant Ronald McLean Avaroa, former mayor of La Paz and a current lecturer at Harvard University. Thank you everyone for being here. Founded by the US Congress, the Reagan Facel Democracy Fellows program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now celebrating our 15th anniversary, NED has hosted more than 250 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to democracy in Bolivia. A hallmark of a true democracy is the periodic alternation of executive power. In Bolivia, uncertainty about a possible political transition looms large as the country prepares for presidential elections in 2019. In 2016, President Evo Morales lost a referendum that would have allowed him to run for a fourth consecutive term in office. Despite his defeat, he has expressed his intent to remain in power beyond 2020, when he is scheduled to leave office. It is yet unclear how and whether he will succeed in his efforts. Delayed national elections, violence, increasing social and political polarization could all occur during this process. To shed light into this and other issues, Raul will discuss Bolivia's possible political and economic future and reflect on the rise of Evo Morales' populist administration. Raul Peñaranda is a prominent journalist, author, and advocate for freedom of expression and freedom of the press in Bolivia. He currently serves as the managing editor at the Bolivian news agency Agencia de Noticias Fides, and as a columnist of Página 7, a daily newspaper that he founded in 2010. His most recent book, Control Remoto, denounces the mechanisms used by the Bolivian government to infringe on democratic liberties and to control and co-opt independent media. During his fellowship at NED, Raul is laying the foundation for a website dedicated to the promotion and protection of freedom of expression, access to information, and democracy in Bolivia. Ronald McLean Avaroa was the first democratically elected mayor of La Paz, Bolivia, and was re-elected 4 times between 1985 and 1995. Appointed the youngest minister at age 29, he has held 5 national cabinet positions, including planning, foreign affairs, communication, finance, and sustainable development and the environment, under 3 different Bolivian administrations. He studied at Harvard University, where he now lectures on issues of decentralization, citizen participation, and anti-corruption. We will now turn the floor over to Raul, who will speak for around 25 minutes, followed by Ronald for about 10 minutes. For those of you following this presentation and contributing to the presentation on Twitter, please use the hashtag NEDEvents or follow the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NED Democracy. If you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members who have contributed to this event, especially Ian Graham, who has offered vital assistance to Raul's fellowship project and today's presentation. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the NED.
Thank you, Fabiola, for the warm introduction. I also want to thank the NED staff for helping me to do this presentation, but more broadly also for giving me this opportunity to be here in Washington for this 5-month period. It has been a great experience, challenging time of learning, and also to be in a way of the problems that we have back at home. And also, it's my pleasure to be here with Ronnie McLean, a rare kind of politician. He's a combination of honesty, intelligence, and efficiency. And we don't have much of that combination in politicians today in Bolivia. Let me start my presentation by doing an introduction to Bolivia. In case you don't know where Bolivia is, it's right there in the heart of South America, as we used to say. We have 10 million inhabitants, large indigenous population. We cannot really give a figure of how large that population is because this is a self-identity thing, and because of that changes through years. But it is fair to say that probably at least or around 50% of the population is indigenous. 1.1 million square kilometers, so it's a big country like California and Texas combined, or France and Spain combined, but with that low population, 10 million people. Landlocked and heavily dependent on raw materials. Before doing this, as you know, the bulk of international attention on Latin America is centered on the tragedy that we witness about Venezuela. This is understandable, but sometimes gets missing that Bolivia is currently standing before a political crossroads itself, and that one of the potential outcomes is to suffer a crisis not so different to the one that we see in Venezuela. Let me tell you a little bit about this crossroads. Bolivia had been a democracy since 1982. Despite this, the last 11 years of Bolivian history has been dominated by President Evo Morales, a left-wing populist who came to power democratically in 2005, but has used much of the 11 years since to solidify his rule through various undemocratic means. Already serving his third term, which is unconstitutional, Morales lost a 2016 referendum that would have legalized his fourth period as president. As Fabiola said, Morales has declared his intention to compete anyway in the 2019 elections. All of this presents the problem of whether an alternation of power will be possible. If election results don't go Morales' way, we could witness a situation similar to Venezuela's and a failed transition, with all the suffering that comes with it. I'll try to address all these topics during my presentation. I will start reflecting on the rise of Evo Morales and his consolidation of power. You see there in this slide some of the key ideas that I want to present. But before that, I would like to start saying that democracy was attained, as I said, in 1982, and later on the country embraced neoliberal free market reforms on the economy. There was positive change and many progresses and improvements were made after 1982. Bolivia had freedom of expression, political liberties, and rule of law was strengthened. However, an important part of society felt that the economic progress was too slow. Poverty was being addressed, but at the pace that was exasperating different social sectors. At the same time, indigenous population felt marginalized. Also, the political system was detached from the people. Society saw the political system as distant and corrupt. That led to a period of grave instability and disarray. Bolivia had 3 presidents between 2002 and 2006. Bolivian population was eager for change. So this is when Evo Morales presented himself as the champion of the poor and the champion of change. He's an indigenous himself, so it makes perfect sense for everybody that in a country that is 50% or so around that of indigenous descent, we should have, for the first time in our history, a president who's an indigenous himself. He was the promise of a positive change and a person that could have broadened democracy. He took important decisions, one of them the nationalization of the gas fields. Also, it's important to notice that he has led the country in the best economic decade of our history. In the last 10 years, Bolivia's economy has received $90 billion because of the exports of natural gas and minerals. $90 billion for a tiny economy like Bolivia's and a poor country is really a lot. So in the last 10 years, the Bolivian economy received more resources than 100 years before that. So in the hands of the president, almost, we had this huge amount of money. In 10 years, more than 100 years prior to that. And of course, that's always helpful, handy for any president to have that huge amount of money. His government has managed the economy well, but has not diversified it nor addressed other important needs like advancing the health or education areas. From a democratic figure to a strongman. So Evo Morales was the promise of change, was the promise of a leader that could broaden democracy. He was representing the people, the poor, and he was representing the marginalized, the indigenous population. But then he began to slowly to convert in a strongman. His current third term is unconstitutional. Our constitution says that a president can run twice. I mean, being twice in 2 periods. We have a 2-period limit, two terms. And he promised that he was not going to go for a third term and this was when the opposition had the possibility of blocking the new constitution. So he negotiated with the opposition in 2008 and 2009, and he promised that he only was going to be 2 terms in power. After that, he actually said that he cheated. Les hice trampa in Spanish. Actually, I mean, he didn't lie about that. Les hice trampa. I cheated on them. I tricked them, he said, and to be able to run again on a third term because he asked a constitutional court that he controls to approve this third term. Then he said that he was not going to run for a 4th term. He promised that again. And then, as we mentioned already, he called for a referendum last year that he lost to be able to run for a 4th term. After the referendum, he said that he was going to accept the will of the people and that he was going to step down in 2020, 3 more years. In January is the end of his term. And then he changed his mind again. I will talk about that later, he said that yes, he has the right to run again, and that is going to be the best thing for the country. He controls the judiciary completely. All judges and prosecutors are under the control of the government. There's no verdict that the judge has taken in these years that could challenge an important decision of President Morales, for example, running for a 3rd time, etc. The opposition leaders are persecuted. Some of them are in jail in Bolivia, others are on exile. Many of those leaders that are on exile in this country and also in other countries, many of them are honest, innocent political leaders, but they cannot prove that because there's no judiciary that could actually take their cases. The capture of the media is one of the things that Morales have done. I'm a journalist by profession. That's what I do for a living. I'm a journalist, and I've been also part of the attack of the government. The government has used several ways to capture the media. One was through businessmen related to the government to buy news outlets in Bolivia. Some of them very important, like the most important newspaper in a city, etc. Also, the government has increased the budget for advertisement, for government advertisement, to 150 million, 15 times before Evo Morales. 150 million a year to distribute among media outlets. So it's a huge amount of money. If you want to have those very interesting contracts, well, then you have to change your editorial views, maybe fire or change some editors in the newsroom, and then you could have that money. Also verbal attacks, trials. Myself, I'm prosecuted, I was sued by the president himself when he said that myself and other 2 editors defamed him and we insulted him when we wrote a story. And that trial is still on. We don't know if that trial could suddenly get restarted. Now it's like government didn't move that trial, but it is there. Many of my colleagues are in the same situation. The government said that there's a cartel of lies of 4 journalists, one of them me, and 4 media outlets. This cartel of lies is destabilizing the country, the government said. And then the vice president said that those 4 journalists should be detained. One of the 4 fled to Brazil. A 5th journalist that it was he thought that he was in peril of being detained went to also to another country in the region. And finally, crackdown on civil society. There is a new law that forces the NGOs or other non-profit entities in Bolivia to re-register. Only 5% of the all NGOs have done that. To do that, to have your registry good again, your papers again, you have to sign a document where you say that you accept and you will respect the national policies of the government. So this is totally against the freedom of association. You can, I mean, there is hundreds of issues when you don't agree with the government. That's precisely the point, to disagree with the government. But the president favored this law. So I want to address one thing. If you have a strongman like Evo Morales is, that controls the judiciary, the media, all the resources, there's no pushback, there's no checks and balances. So president can do actually whatever he wants. Evo's strongman status has allowed him to waste $2 billion in state resources on ill-conceived or unnecessary public works. I will show you some of them. A museum for Evo in the middle of nowhere. In the right is the picture of the hometown of Evo, where he was born. It's Orinoca. It's a city of 600 people. 500 of these 600 people, so I don't know, 80%, don't have access to running water. It's very far away. There's a road that goes there, but it's around 6 hours from La Paz. So he decided to build a beautiful Smithsonian-style museum there. Actually, very, very impressive. To show his T-shirts, because he likes to play soccer. He was never a professional soccer player, but he displays, as you see, many of the T-shirts that he used. There's a statue of him, also many pictures of him, a soccer ball, a precise or a specific soccer ball that he used once playing against someone, and he did a penalty kick, and he scored. So the ball is there. The soccer shoes, yeah, you laugh, but we don't. The soccer shoes that he used also in the past, his poor shoes when he was a little boy, etc. So this is it's a paradox. In a 600 people village where 500 don't have running water, the president decides to do there, because he was born there, a museum of $7 million. A stadium without spectators in the jungle of Chimoré. Chimoré is in the middle of the country, in El Chapare. Chimoré has 11,000 people, that's the population of the town, and the stadium has 15,000 seats, so more seats than people. So it's never full. You cannot fill this stadium. When they play like a local game, most of the time there is 300 or 400 people watching the game, because it's in a small town. So that's it. Airports without passengers. This is in Oruro. It's a city near La Paz, 2-hour drive from La Paz. Normally, what people from Oruro would do was to take a car or a bus from Oruro to La Paz and take a flight there. But the president thought that it was a good idea to have an airport there. But of course, there's no passengers, because there's no airlines that go there, because there's no market. So the airport is empty, as you see. A new 28-story palace for Evo in the heart of La Paz. If you see there, that's our humble but beautiful seat of government, where the president works. For 150 years, the Bolivian presidents used this building, but he thought that it was too small, and now he's building this thing 28 stories high in an area of the city where it's the old town, where all the houses are small, to be able to govern in a more proper way. Other examples, a sugar plant without sugar cane in San Buenaventura in the north of La Paz. The factory was inaugurated last year, and 2 months later was shut down, expecting in the future to have more cane. A gas plant without enough gas, Planta Separadora de Líquidos, in the Chaco region of the country. The plant is called Villegas. An urea and fertilizers plant without trains to export it. In the middle of the country, also near the Chimore Stadium, there's this plant. Supposedly the market for the urea and fertilizers is Brazil, very far away. It would be much logic to put the factory in the border of Brazil, but they didn't do it. And also it's very, very big. We don't know what's going to happen with that. So $2 billion wasted on these works. But more importantly, Bolivia lost the opportunity to diversify its economy and address the challenges of advancing education, health, and other sectors. We were the poorest country in South America 10 years ago, and we're still being the poorest country in South America now, because other countries also were taking advantage of these high prices of raw materials that in general in the region we use. So other countries like Peru, for example, Colombia, Chile before that, were growing much more than Bolivia. So it's the lost decade, the lost opportunity. We had the best decade in our history, almost 200 years of independent history, and we missed the opportunity to advance, to get better, to address the true problems of the country instead of building palaces and stadiums without spectators. So Bolivia's road ahead. As I said, Evo lost the referendum in 2016. The referendum asked the people something like, would you like the President Morales to run for a third term, actually fourth, but the first was like deleted. It is not legally accepted by the government. Anyway, it was referring to the fourth. So the question was something like that. Would you accept to have Evo Morales running for a fourth term? The ballot said third. And 49% of the people say yes, 51 said no. But anyway, President said that he will run again. First he said, yes, I will resign, I will go to my farm in El Chapare, and then he changed his mind. So he says that he has 4 windows to run again. The first one is to call a new referendum through a national law. The second one is to call a new referendum through popular participation, signatures of the people. The third one is a constitutional interpretation, like the Nicaraguan model. And the fourth is resigning 6 months earlier to be eligible to compete again. The first 2 are maybe more democratic, because the people should vote again. But we should not forget that we already did that. We voted and we said no. It's like Brexit. When you vote for Brexit, to exit the European Union, you don't vote again to re-enter. Or like American people chose Trump. You don't vote 1 year later saying, hey, no. That's the will of the people. I mean, we already voted. But anyway, the first 2 are more democratic. The other 2 are crazy. The constitutional interpretation, of course, the Constitutional Court is under the control of the government. One, they already accepted this third term, so most probably they will do again. The Nicaraguan model is that the Nicaraguan court made a verdict saying that the term limits limit the rights of the president, the political right, the civil rights of the president are limited when there is term limits. So to erase that limitation for the president as a citizen, they allowed or they deleted in Nicaragua the term limits, and now there is not such a thing. And the other is that resigning 6 months earlier to be eligible to compete again with a judiciary that would be independent. The fourth one, you can understand that is totally nonsense. We proved that Evo Morales was beatable in the 2016 referendum for the first time. You can see anyway his very impressive results, electoral results. In 2005, he had more than 50% of the vote, and in those four elections, he had more than 60%. So he was very popular. He still is, and very powerful too. In 2008, the opposition thought that it was a good idea to call a recall referendum. It wasn't. And he got 66% of the vote, I think, to repeal that recall referendum. In 2009, there was 61% of the people approving the new constitution, and in 2009 and 14, we got the presidential elections, and he got also more than 60%. So for the first time in 2016, he lost the referendum, first loss in 11 years. So this opens an opportunity for democracy in Bolivia, for a re-democratization of the country. Evo can run, but now he can lose. Those are polls that Página 7, a daily, does in Bolivia. Who would you vote for in the first round if the elections were held this Sunday? And you see that Evo Morales has around 30%. So the colors are January, March, and May, around 30%. And he's Carlos Mesa, former president, around 20%. So you need 50% to get in power, and so you see that everyone is very far away, but also Evo. The other candidates have much less popularity, but they are all from the opposition. This is an open question in the poll, but the respondents don't make in their minds any other leader than Evo in the government, so everyone here is from the opposition. Would you vote for Evo Morales or Carlos Mesa in the second round? As anyone can win the election, so the next question is, would you vote for Evo versus Carlos Mesa? There are also other questions from Evo versus the other candidates, but I'm gonna only put this chart. So the red one is Carlos Mesa. From September last year to May this year, 1 month ago, with this question, Carlos Mesa beats Morales. So as I told you, that's an opportunity. And his approval, job approval, numbers have dropped. He had a whopping 77% in August 2014 of positive job approval, 77. This is huge. And then he went down. This is the last figure that I have is January 2017. But the last chart, the last poll, I couldn't include it here, is down 35. So that's his job approval. But the opposition is not united. We have really a fractioned opposition. The opposition does not have a clear idea of where to go, what promise to give to the Bolivian people. There are very unclear or abstract ideas of recovering democracy, etc. So the opposition is not united. They don't have a proper idea of how would be a government without Evo. Also, we have to say that the person that was in the poll, Carlos Mesa, has not decided to be a candidate. He has said that he's not a candidate. The polls are all the time measuring him, but he said officially that he is not a candidate. Maybe he will change his mind, hopefully, in the future. But why is this? Because Carlos Mesa was toppled in 2005, so he fears that a new government for him would be like the same, going again to a nightmare. So he has not decided. So this is to show you my idea that Bolivia is at the crossroads. This is the last slide to show you some different possible political outcomes post-2019. The first two are the most positive that I can imagine. An opposition candidate wins and comes to power, and then that means that democracy is preserved, that we have alternation of power, and that we can regain institutions, and that we could move forward. The second is Evo Morales does not run, and another government candidate wins, like in the Ecuadorian case, where Correa took Moreno and Moreno won. We have to ask if those elections in Ecuador were free and fair, or if there is fraud, how the elections were run. And the same for Bolivia. As you saw, Evo has all the resources, the popularity, the judges, everything, the media, etc. So the elections are not fair and free. But anyway, I put that also like a positive outcome. A candidate from the government wins and gets to power, totally normal. The possibility number 3, Evo Morales runs and wins. Again, he shouldn't, because the Constitution says that, and because we voted for a referendum, and because now they are trying to do this very interesting thing like resigning 6 months earlier to be eligible again. And the two last are the most worrying that we could have, the Venezuelan model. Evo Morales delays the 2019 elections before he can lose, or Evo Morales loses and does not want to give up power. Sometimes when I say this, some Bolivian fellows think that that is not possible, that Evo would never do that. But it's precisely and exactly what is happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is in such crisis today because last year, instead of going to a recall referendum that it was legally managed by the opposition, they did all the steps to have that recall referendum. The electoral court in Venezuela decided not to go to that recall referendum. Also, last year, Venezuela had to have regional elections, like municipalities and gubernatorial elections, and they were delayed. So the crisis in Venezuela, which is now also a humanitarian crisis, is because of that, because they delayed the elections. And so I don't think that is also that we can rule out in the Bolivian case. Maybe this is going to happen. I hope that one of the two first possibilities really would be the possible outcomes. So to end, and to thank you again for your presence here, I would say that the international community has to be alert in what is going on in Bolivia and to help us to have a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that great presentation, Raul. I think you hit all the right issues. And now for a short commentary, I pass it on to Ronald McLean.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And it's a privilege to comment on Raul's presentation. I'm not returning the favor, but I have great respect for him as an honest, straightforward, and very courageous journalist. On reading his presentation and listening to him now, I wanted to just follow some of the points that he made. And although I agree with 90% of what he said, I have a few points that perhaps are different in my presentation. The first one is the title itself. Instead of calling an era, I would call the end of an authoritarian government. That's it. And weakening of democracy in Bolivia. It's true that there was expansion of democratic participation in Bolivia during Evo Morales' regime. And it's also true that there was ethnic inclusion, what I call the Obama effect, breaking the glass ceiling. Because any indigenous boy today may think that he can become president of Bolivia, and I don't think that was the case before. So that's a very important achievement that we can attribute to his rule. But the longest single authoritarian government in 100 years. Repressive in civic liberties, as Raul said, but basically institutionally regressive. Much of the institutional modernization that we did in Bolivia has been destroyed. So it's been very regressive. Hyper-corruption is there by the scale. It's electorally efficient, but it's essentially anti-democratic. Now, there are three reasons that Raul gives to the rise of Evo to power, and I'll name them. One was the failure of neoliberal policies. In fact, they were rather successful. We had economic stability and defeat of hyperinflation, no minor feat in the early 80s. Participación Popular, which is a hugely successful program that really integrated a lot of people. It was part of the massive, largest redistribution of public funds in the country's history. We have the elimination of public enterprise chronic deficits, because we capitalized. When I say we, it's the country, it's not my party, right? That indeed was against capitalization. Large increase of gas reserves and exports that led to the export, and a dramatic expansion of the agricultural exports in Bolivia, the expansion of the east frontier. So all those policies were very successful, so they cannot explain the rise of Evo Morales very well. Now, previous governments perceived as corrupt, okay? They were actually not so much corrupt as weak, and I really regret that to say, because they were very weak. They were never able to defend democratic rule of law. We had the April 2001 or 2000 war of water, the February 2003 riots and arson in La Paz, Sorata's tourist hostages and armed assault to the police and army. And then we had the October insurrection and the overthrow of a legitimate government. And the democratic liberal governments were not able to stop that and defend the rule of law. So they were more than corrupt, they were weak. And as Samuel Huntington said, the worst governments are not the left or the right, are the weak governments. Perception of hyper-corruption. This is an irony here. And detachment from people's needs. I would say that the campaign of 2002 was fueled by Sánchez de Lozada's strategy to present Bolivia as the most corrupt country at the time. And that was a message that was bought from the people. And now we can easily see that Bolivia was not the hyper-corruption country that it was presented. But it was part of the strategy of the electoral strategy of Goni's campaign. Raul says that indigenous felt marginalized. I don't think so. And why I say that? Indigenous people had made progress during the pre-2000 government by doing, we had in 1992 during Paz Zamora's government, we had the peaceful march on La Paz, which was a positive aspect. The same year, Bolivia promoted an international indigenous fund, Fondo Indígena, which was headed by a Bolivian, by Cárdenas. That was a very positive thing. In 1994, we have the Ley of Participación Popular, which basically benefited indigenous people. And moreover, in 2000, during Mr. Banzer's presidency, and I was Minister of Finance, we had the Diálogo Nacional, which redistributed $1.5 billion of the forgiven debt of Bolivia among basically preferably indigenous people. So it was not the indigenous people who they were. They were poor Chapare coca-growing peasants, felt economically repressed and military abused. That was the essence of the rebellion. It was not the indigenous people itself. And we will see later on how Evo Morales' government attacked the indigenous populations with the tipnis and other ways. So, Coca Zero, which was a policy of our government, it was an eradication without appropriate compensation. That was probably the origin of the rise of Evo Morales, plus the funding of the Participación Popular to the Chapare municipalities and so on and so forth. So the last reason that is given for rise of power of Evo Morales. Society wanted to see change. Yes, but not that kind of change. In fact, Bolivians were majority voting for a former younger military mayor, who's sitting right here, and former mayor of Cochabamba. He was heading the polls by far. But then Mr. Sánchez de Lozada's negative campaign strategy was directed to bring Reyes Villa down. The result was not that he won, which he did by a small margin, but the result was that Reyes Villa's vote went mostly to Evo Morales and brought him to 1 percentage point behind Sánchez de Lozada. So that was the beginning of the real rise of Evo Morales, because in the next election he was unbeaten. So the consolidation of power. And Raul talks about the democratic figure to a strong man. I don't think that we should analyze the person itself. It's not a matter of people, it's a matter of systems. And behind Evo Morales, there's a systemic effort to deconstruct democracy in Bolivia. They eliminated the balances, the checks and balances. They eliminated the independence of the different powers of government. And at the same time, they instituted a political repression without precedents in Bolivia, criminalizing the political opposition. We are all criminals. If you're part of the opposition, you are all criminals, which is the Cuban model. And we have the largest number of political exiles ever in the history of Bolivia. Some of them are here in this room today. And then the opposition candidates were illegally disqualified, which is done in Ecuador and Venezuela and so on and so forth. So the net result of this is the deconstruction of liberal democracy and the emergence of a hyper-corrupt autocracy. Now, kindly, Raul refers to Evo as a style of strong man in power. The behavior follows a long tradition of tyrants. I call it a tyrant, un tirano. A long tradition of tyrants, both military and civilian, although much closer to military despots of our history like Melgarejo and Garcia Mesa. Autocratic, megalomaniac, and corrupt by action or neglect. And they hold a monopoly of power, a lot of discretionality, and a lack of accountability, which is the perfect formula for corruption. So, to finish, the alternation of power. That is the question. That is the litmus test of democracy. Is the peaceful transfer of power among different governments. And from 1982 to 2005, Bolivia had 7 constitutional presidents transfer power peacefully in open and fair elections. That is a great success. 7 presidents were elected democratically and freely in open elections. Evo forced out 2 constitutional presidents, Sanchez de Lozada and Carlos Mesa, changing the constitution, disavowed his own constitution to rule for 3 consecutive terms, and is seeking a 4th term, as Raul said. The result of that is he said, what is the Bolivian road ahead? And my answer would be, end of the road, our road to serve, or the road to serve them. Or this government ends, or we are going to follow the road to serve them. And the choice is between autocracy and democracy. Evo's 4 windows of continuism are not democratic by definition. Those are the roads to serve, like in Venezuela. And then we have one real problem, is the absence of an enforcer of the Constitution. Nobody is the armed forces who should be called for that, because that's the constitutional duty. They are neutralized in Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, and nobody can enforce the Constitution of Bolivia.
Well, thank you very much to both Raul and Ronald for very insightful presentations, and I think we will have many questions, and I will reserve the right to ask the first one if that's okay with everyone. First, I wanted to ask Raul a little bit about the kind of state of democratic institutions, and this is something that you alluded to and that Ronald also described a little bit in more detail, but how is the democratic infrastructure in Bolivia, who can make some of those more positive scenarios possible? Electoral authorities, the judiciary, and what would need to change between now and the 2019 elections to ensure that some of those positive outcomes remain in the sphere of the possible? I guess that's first question to you. And then to Ronald, you made very strong arguments in favor of these economic neoliberal policies. This is a very contentious issue in Bolivia. And I wanted to challenge you a little bit, because if we see some of the numbers that Raul presented, you see that Evo has had 70% approval ratings 10 years after being in office. So somehow people were still disaffected, dissatisfied with those economic policies of the 90s and early 2000s. So what do you attribute that to? I mean, how can you explain that if you think that those were the right policies, but somehow still produced dissatisfied citizens? So maybe we'll start with Raul, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Fabiola, for a very hard question, difficult question to answer. Yes, our democratic institutions are very weak, as I said, judiciary, etc. All the watchdog institutions, government institutions, are also very weak. La Contraloría, the institution that oversees all the public servants, including the president, is in the hands of a guy from the political party in government. The Defensor del Pueblo, the Ombudsman, also the same thing. Actually, it's a shame that he's there. Maybe I would say that the press and the alliance between the press of some tiny part of the media outlets, very few, but they have an alliance between them and social media, and I think that's a possibility. I think that Bolivian people gets really an open flow of information because of that. So I think that we have to keep that assured, safe. But as I wrote recently in a post that for the CIMA blog, I said that if the number of media outlets are diminishing, maybe that alliance between that and social media is going to get weaker and weaker. But right now, I think that that's one of the key aspects for our democratic future.
Okay, well, thank you.
There is no way you can defeat an autocratic tyranny with democratic rules. I mean, this is like a soccer game in which the referees already bought. Their goal is very small compared to the one of the opposition. All the rules are changed. So it's an illusion. The electoral court is totally partial. The courts in general, the Supreme Tribunal and everything. So it's very a fantasy, and we are following this little fantasy that 2019 would be we could defeat him. He will never let himself be defeated. He will not hold elections, or he will rig the elections. So unfortunately, it's not the way, because it's not a democracy any longer. So you cannot play democratic rules to an autocratic tyranny. Now, on the neoliberal policy.
Sorry, before we move on to the economic policies, I just wanted to challenge you a little bit there, because he has had a recent defeat with the 2016 referendum, where the electoral authorities were, everybody perceived them to be very much in Evo's favor. So somehow that was still possible, but you still, and if not, that there is no democratic path, then what is the alternative? And remember, we're at the National Democratic Institute.
But
National Endowment for Democracy.
Evo Morales was convinced that he was going to win the referendum, and he lost at the last minute. It was a total surprise. He would have never called a referendum if he knew that he was going to lose. His numbers were much higher when he called the referendum. So it was a total surprise for him, and he won't repeat the mistake. Now, on the economic program, which is hard to be neoliberal, we are a pre-capitalistic society. So it's much to say that we have liberal policies. I wish we had, but we don't. There are a hybrid mixture of things. But economic stability is not a minor feat. And the defeat of hyperinflation was a great success. Effective Participación Popular is undoubtedly one of the most important programs for Bolivia, and is an example worldwide. We eliminated the source of inflation by getting rid of the public companies that were losing money chronically. Then, thanks to the policies, we had a great reserves of gas, which we don't have anymore, because when he changed the rules, now nobody is investing in exploration in Bolivia. And therefore, he benefited from huge increases in export because of prices, not really quantity. And the $90 billion that Raul mentions, it's a dream in Bolivia. I mean, our export, when I was minister, I think it was $1 billion a year. Now they are close to 12, I think, or something like that, or 8 plus more than 8. So if you think of yourself, of your salary, your yearly salary, and I multiply that by 8 times, you're a different person. So there was also a dramatic expansion of the agricultural frontier in the east, with soya and so on and so forth, agribusiness. So these policies really were the basis for much of what happened later. But then, if you have a preste, we call it a fiesta, with $90 billion on your disposal, discretionary, not using a bidding system, just disposing of money of the central bank, embarking in a pharaonic project, including the telepheric, which I like so much, for 130 million with a $60 million overprice. I mean, everybody was happy. So if you come as a politician to Bolivia, like 5 years ago, and then you start complaining, say, no, where the money is coming from for all these drinks and food and so on and so forth, people say to you, oh, have a drink, don't spoil the party. But the party is getting to an end. And so with that amount of money, there was not necessary to do any institutional reforms. They regress. There's no water in La Paz because they nationalized the water company. So the contrast will be starking after a while.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to take 3 at a time. Please identify, give your name and your affiliation as your question. Carl, and then Katia. Yeah, and wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I want to just pursue this point that Ronald has just raised about you can't have change through elections if the government is an autocratic government. And I mean, I guess there are 2 questions here. First, look at a lot of other examples. The thing that frightens regimes in Russia, in Iran, and so forth is what they call colored revolutions. They talk about it all the time. And what is a colored revolution? A colored revolution is a revolution that takes place where there has been a stolen election, where people participate in the election, but the results, they feel the results have been stolen and they revolt. This happened in Ukraine with the Orange Revolution in 2004. It happened in Serbia in 2000 in the election against Milosevic, which he claimed he won, then people came to the streets, and then he was ousted. And in a way, it happened in a number of other places. It almost happened in Iran in 2009, but they cut it off with, a violent protest, a violent repression of those protests. You had Nicaragua in 91 with the Sandinistas in power, and they won an election. You had Chile in 88 under Pinochet with the referendum. You had the Philippines, the People's Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986. In other words, you have examples of this, and you should, given what you said, address those examples, and then also address what the alternative strategy is. In other words, what do you propose? A boycott? In which case, what will that accomplish? A violent revolution? I mean, what is your alternative strategy to that? And what would you advise, for example, the people in Venezuela today? I mean, they're involved in a difficult struggle. They won the parliamentary elections in 2015, and they're involved in a struggle right now, and the opposition remains united in the mood. Is there an alternative to what they're trying to do?
Thank you. Sorry, we're going to take 3 questions and then going to look. Yes, they are very difficult. Katia?
Thank you. Katia Salazar, Due Process of Law Foundation. I have a question to Raul about the justice system in Bolivia. As we all know, Bolivia is the only country in Latin America that has introduced the election by popular vote for high court members, for high court justices. This is the only country in Latin America that has this system. And a new election is coming. So I would like to know your opinion about the system itself, if it has worked or not, and also about the coming elections that I think they are going to be on October or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more. Sorry, yeah, the gentleman over there, and then we'll go back to the panelists.
Good afternoon. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in DC. I'm building universities all over the world, and I was wondering if anyone could speak to the college situation in the nation of Bolivia and what you would see if there was someone from the United States negotiating having students from Bolivia learning in different nations and bringing that wealth of knowledge back to the country to help benefit the nation and make it not be the poorest country in South America. If you could speak on the university situation before I waste my time. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We're going to start with Raul and then go to Ronald.
Thank you.
And you can address any one of them in any order.
Excellent. First, I will leave the very hard question of Carl to running. But in general,
That's what the friends are for.
no. But I would say that we have to keep in mind that we have to play by the rules of democracy if we have to, if we want to make a change. That's my idea. And of course, protests in the streets are also rules of democracy. I mean, the possibility of people protesting, I think it's totally fine. And as I said in my presentation, I'm half optimistic that change could happen, but of course there are other possibilities too. About the judiciary elections, yes, we are the only country in South America, in the Latin America, and maybe one of the few in the world that we have popular election to elect the Supreme Court judges, the Constitutional Court, and two other courts. One is the Judiciary Council. That is very important because that Judiciary Council elects the new judges, appoints the new judges. So we go through a popular vote to elect them. The first experience was absolutely awful. We had the worst situation in the judiciary in maybe, I don't know, 1 century. We never had a good judiciary in the past, but now it's really crazy. The people that get chosen by popular vote were very inefficient, corrupt, and of course they were also very pro-government. But there is something that I want to say. One of those judges, Alberto Cusi, showed some independence from the government, and immediately the Congress sued him, and at the end he was dismissed. So if this path doesn't work, so the Congress chooses the candidates that go to the popular ballot, if some of those are somewhat independent from the government, then the Congress makes sue them and then dismisses them. So it's really incredible. Yes, now we're going to have the same stupid show that right now there are 492 candidates that went to Congress with their papers saying that they have lawyers that want to be in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's incredible. And then, yes, there is a committee in Congress that has majority of the government party, and they are filtering all the candidates, and so it's going to be a mess. The same thing that we did years ago. I'm totally pessimistic about that situation. I don't think that this is a good way of having any kind of a good judiciary, voting for people that you don't really even know. And about the university situation and the college situation, I would go even further to say that high school in Bolivia or elementary school, I think that those are the changes that have to be made. You know that there's this PISA test. This is an international test that like 70 countries in the world take when kids turn 15. And generally all the Asian countries and also Nordic countries in Europe, and then the US, Europe, and then other countries in South America and Asia get the best in the ranking. But generally Asia and Northern Europe are in the best position. Bolivia doesn't want to get in that test because it would be really, of course, we would be the last in the 70 countries least. But it wouldn't matter. I mean, it would be some place to start to build up a better situation for the next time and to show the people how bad we are. the Alcaldía, the municipality of La Paz, did an informal PISA test last year, and they gave the results. It was unofficial, but anyway, we were precisely the last country, like 50% of the results compared to the last country in Latin America. So we were like half of the last country that is Peru. So really, we need a change in our education system to make kids to think, to learn, not to repeat, to reflect about things, to have critical thinking, and this passes to college. I'm sorry to say that our universities have very politicized, ideological kind of education, and so we're missing the opportunity. And of course, one generation after other in Bolivia don't get really a proper opportunity to get better professionals, and of course, with that, help the country.
Thank you.
Well,
Ronnie.
it's important to know that the government and the mass has a veto power on the list of judicial appointments. So they disqualified anybody who is not in their line. So you can expect, of course, you cannot expect an impartial court. On your question, Carl, I am appalled to see the human tragedy in Venezuela, and I really don't want my country to go to that slaughterhouse. The cost of doing that way through protests in the streets is ever increasing, and there's no sign that it's affecting the Venezuelan government at all. Now, what is the difference with the revolutions in Eastern Europe? First, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. There was a deep economic crisis, and there was support of the West. There was active support of the Western countries to that change in regime. There's no such support for us. The United States doesn't intervene, the Europeans look from afar, and it's left entirely to the poor people of Bolivia to try to change this. And I think it's criminal to ask them to play the democratic role, the democratic rules, when there is no democracy. It's just a fake. It buys them time. And so the case of Europe is totally different. And we have seen the other example is Cuba. There's no way you criminalize the opposition, and there's no external support, and the Castros are there for 50 more plus years, and they are going to stay even longer. The next generation, I think we have high hopes that things will change. I am not so sure. So since I retired from politics, I cannot give you the answer to your last question, because I don't see I mean, let me say, the 2019 elections are going to be either not held at all, or it's going to be a mockery of democracy, because there are no institutional framework for a democratic election. The courts are partialized, the electoral court is partialized. In the countryside in Bolivia, there is no more individual secret votes. They have to show how they are voting, and there are stiff penalties and ostracism for those who don't vote for the government. So there is no democracy, unfortunately. I wish it was.
I'm going to respectfully disagree, but let's move on to other questions. Yes,
I would like
Benito.
You to
Yeah, I will.
Why don't you
we'll
tell
overwine.
me?
Benito. Yeah.
I'd like to thank both speakers for their. I'm Kevin Healy, adjunct faculty at Georgetown University. I'd like to thank our speakers. Very substantive remarks, critiques of the MAS performance in a democratic framework. I wanted to enlarge the discussion a little bit, something neither of you, I believe, have talked about, and that is a problem of racism in Bolivian democracy. We have a big problem in our own democracy of racism. We're dealing with it, and new challenges come up all the time. The Obama election was not the end of racism, obviously. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on what the impact of the MAS government is on this aspect of democracy, which to me, following Bolivia, is a very important area, and I don't think it's been given sufficient discussion and analysis here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry, I have a question here in the front and then one in the back. The gentleman here had his hand over here. Sorry, and then over there.
Miguel Moreno from Leadership Forum International. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that countries have to be driven by principles. One of them is the rule of law it's been mentioned by the presenter and Ronald in a very good presentation, by the way. And the second is the freedom of the individuals. And these two things have been broken in Bolivia. One, because there is no rule of law. The powers of government are in the hands of a dictatorship that has been mentioned also in the conference. And on the other hand, the will of the people, showing in the referendum that they didn't want to have the president being voted again, it's been broken also. And those are some of the consequences of political unrest or the disastrous situation right now we have in Venezuela. So I think in this regards and somehow trying to come up with ideas answering the question that the gentleman here had, I think in Bolivia, one of the things that has to be reestablished is the electoral system. So that if there is a new election, then international organizations have to audit, supervise, and probably reorganize the electoral system so we will have in 2019 new fair elections. The other thing is that we have more than 1,000 political exiles internationally, some of them in Argentina, Peru, Chile, Brazil, the United States, and some of them government appointees, governors that were elected by the people who've been persecuted and prosecuted in Bolivia, and now they are in exile. So the second thing we need to do is to put some pressure internationally by Bolivians in the diaspora or voluntarily in other countries to bring them back to these elected officials and also political exiles. And some of them governors or leaders in different countries. And the next thing that we should do is to have some allies in the new context of this new political framework that we're living internationally. New presidents in Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil is going to change also. These individuals, they should put some pressure so that Bolivia, that is the heartland of the continent, has to restore democracy. And it's a very important role for countries neighboring Bolivia, for the United States, all of us that are living here. It's a matter of even security.
Are you finishing? Is there a question?
So my question goes, what Bolivians living in the United States, for example, can do specifically, besides our vote, to help the 2019 election to become fair and transparent?
Okay, thank you. There was one last question, I think, in the back. Sorry, I think the gentleman left, but sure, the fellow. What's his name again? And
thank you.
Try to keep it brief, please, so we can take
Thank you very much. I am Arthur. I'm a NED fellow from Uganda. I think this is a really rich discussion because two different people having a different reading of the same situation makes the discussion, in my view, quite rich, which is a nice and positive thing for me. But building on Carl's intervention earlier, I do think that it's possible to create change through a democratic means and defeat an autocratic leader. It is possible. If you look at examples in Africa, for instance, because that has not yet been mentioned, in the Gambia, in Senegal, even in Zimbabwe, this happened. And so it's, I think the focus should be more on organization rather than feeling like it's an impossible situation. And I do think that the more important challenge is what happens when you actually have defeated a dictator. And in the case of Zambia, not Zambia, but the Gambia, the role of regional bodies becomes crucial. And my question is, do you have an equivalent? I think without ECOWAS, perhaps the Gambian president would have stayed in power even after losing. And I think because SADC was weak in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe could continue under Mugabe the way it is, at least partly. So is there such an opportunity in Bolivia for you know, a regional kind of influence over Bolivia? So that's one. The second one is to Raul. The first one was to both of you, but to Raul, what would happen in a post Evo Morales era? Because it appears that you have leaders who come into power with a promise that everybody buys into, and then they slide back and start making all these changes. So what guarantees do you think are important for a country like Bolivia not to have another leader that promises and then slides back? What kind of guarantees are essential in your view? And finally, what is the history and the role of the military in Bolivia? And what role do you think the military can play? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to try to respond very briefly so we can take one more round of questions. I know that there are a few hands up. So Raul again, and then Ronnie.
Thank you, Arthur. Yes, I think that there are these regional bodies in Latin America. One is precisely the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the new Secretary General of that body is pushing really hard to have democracy back in Venezuela, and he's fighting in that sense. And I think that after Venezuela can reach a point where it recovers democracy, maybe the attention of the OAS is gonna turn to Bolivia. There are democratic means to topple an autocratic government. Ronnie says that it's difficult. I say I'm more optimistic. I think that it is possible. There are many cases like that. I hope that it is possible. But also, following Arthur's question, is that what would happen after that is very important. What would happen after that? In Bolivia, we have really a situation where conflict is permanent and is deep. Right now in Bolivia, with the Evo Morales firm government, there are many social battles. The coca growers that belong to the government are fighting to the coca growers that lean to the opposition, and we have road blockades in different parts of the country. We tend to be very violent to do our protests, and maybe that's going to be the future too. So poor guy or woman that gets to this to that seat in the future. And how can we assure that in the future no one gets back to like an autocratic position? I think that institutions have to be much more stronger. We used to have them before Evo, and sorry to say that they didn't last. But I think that the rebuild the institutionality is so important. And then to speak about racism in Bolivia, I think that it is still a big problem. We have a deep racism in Bolivia. Even though there's a majority of indigenous, there is a racism against them. As Ronnie said, now an indigenous boy can think that he can be president, and that was not the case maybe before Evo. So Evo helped in that sense a great deal. I think that for many indigenous people to see someone that is like him, like them, to be president was a positive thing, like a symbolic thing that it was important. And racism is something that is, sorry to say, in our society for generations, still is. I think that we got better because of the Evo Morales government, but I think that these things really need much more time to really debate them, discuss them, and at the end, hopefully eliminate them.
Thank you. Lenny?
On racism, I think that the United States particularly sees the problem through the American lens. There's not such a stark division in Bolivia between different races. We are all pintados. We are mestizos in the majority, but we fall into a trap. We had a a census in 2000, I think, Alberto, no? And then somebody worked the questions and forgot to put the mestizo part of that. So I was confronted with the idea, are you white? Are you Aymara? Are you Quechua? And I was neither. But there was no option. And so there was this idea that the majority of people were indigenous because very few people consider ourselves white or, you know, any other race. So Bolivia is a mestizo country. Even Evo Morales, he cannot qualify as indigenous. He doesn't speak Aymara, he doesn't speak Quechua. He's a product of Oruro, of the bands of Oruro, the orquestas, the carnaval, soccer, and you know, it's not really an indigenous person. The indigenous people that we dealt with them, they are quite different, and they confronted this government because of the TIPNIs and some other issues, and they're quite different. And as I said, there were specific policies in the past to favor the indigenous people, like the Dialogue 2000 and so on and so forth. So there is discrimination, but moreover now there is reverse discrimination in Bolivia. You cannot wear a tie in Bolivia, you go and cut it off. And there's a kind of reverse discrimination in the universities, in the schools, and so on and so forth. This one will pass. You know, vergüenza contra dinero, we said in Spanish. You know, the intermarriages are common. After the revolution of '52, all the leaders of the revolution changed their wives. They married cruceñas from a different part of Bolivia. And after a few years, they were part of the upper classes of Bolivia. So it's not that stark like it is in the United States. And indeed, Evo Morales coming to power helped quite a bit. But now it has to become more stabilized. At the end, the other question. I finished my comment to Raul asking, who is the constitutional enforcer? We have a constitution, and if they don't apply the constitution, nothing happens. The constitutions give the armed forces the duty to defend the constitution, but they are bought up. In Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, they are being bought up by the regime, and nothing happens. I'm not advocating for a coup, but there must be. We have to look for an answer, and that answer may be international, but the OA is so weak that they can kick Venezuela or Cuba out of the institution, nothing happens. We would need some international enforcer when the countries don't comply with a democratic number of things that they have to do, not just elections, but the rule of law, independence, liberties, civil liberties, so on, so on. There's a long list. The OAS has produced a democratic chart. There's another more recent document which spell out precisely what means to be democratic. Bolivia doesn't pass that test at all. So I don't have an answer, but we have to look for an answer, and there's very little that we can do as civilians from outside of Bolivia.
Thank you. We'll take one last round of questions. I think Mark had one here, and then a gentleman in the back afterwards. And then we'll have some concluding remarks.
Yes, Mark Blattner, Journal of Democracy. This very interesting discussion, in a way, was haunted by the specter of Venezuela and the notion that this is a path that Bolivia might be following before too long, especially if nothing good happens in 2019. I'm just wondering, can you give us some sense of where you think Bolivia is on that path now? I mean, how bad has the economy gotten? You know, what's the condition of the approval ratings of the president? To what extent is the opposition fragmented or united? Could you just give us a little bit of a sense of the situation in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. There was one last question, I think, at the back.
Thank you very much for the presentation and your answers to these questions. So my name is Alex Fraser, and I work at the Department of State. I'm very curious about responses in the international community and how we can respond. So also framing this in the context of Venezuela, where Venezuela is now, and looking at how we as an international community have responded to Venezuela, I'd like to hear how you would think, looking at those steps, what we can do similarly, what we can do differently to be more effective in this case of Bolivia, so that we don't see something in 2020 that looks like Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other last questions, or we're good? Oh, yes. Sorry, I had missed you before.
Hi, my name is Rachel Abrego, and I work at the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. Thanks so much for your time. I have to respectfully disagree, having grown up in Bolivia, about the deeply entrenched racial divides that exist. And I wanted to ask Mr. Peñaranda if you think that furthering education and health, taking race into consideration, if it would be an opportunity to kind of dissolve these racial divides. I feel like what you said about it being a missed opportunity, an economic missed opportunity, is also true for the racial situation in Bolivia. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Ronnie this time, go to Raul, and if you want to have any concluding remarks as part of your answers, that's also a good time.
How far are we on the road to zero? Well, there's still money for the party. The party is still going on. There are plenty of reserves in the central bank. They're holding up the exchange rate artificially. They're still spending a lot of money, but there's a good war chest behind. The things are going to deteriorate, no doubt, and that's why perhaps Evo Morales would arrange for him to leave the presidency and leave it in the equatorial model to somebody else, and that somebody else could be somebody from the opposition, because the great fear in Bolivia is what is going to happen after the opposition, if the opposition wins. Evo Morales was given practically the guitar to play after he was overthrowing government after government with the mobilization of the Chapare. And people got to say, okay, let him govern. And that is a specter. As Raul said, pity to the guy who becomes president after Evo Morales. So the only way that to have a viable government is in a transition model with Evo Morales' consent, in which he will trade pardon against stability. And that could happen. That could happen. But it will be a fake election, of course, because he will remain in power. But it could happen. And the money is going to run out, and that is going to perhaps persuade him to go to Orinoca for a while. They said, what are we going to use? This is a joke. Whether we are going to use that museum for afterwards. And I said, jail. Make it as a jail. Okay.
Thank you. Raul.
Yes, I think that we have a racial divide. We have also, of course, mestizos, mixed people. But really, I think that we have racism in Bolivia. And that maybe through education, through a deeper debate about that, about understanding and looking as at the mirror and understanding and really knowing that happens. But it's getting better. And I think that education, Evo Morales in power, not everything about Evo is wrong. I'm very, maybe you I think that you heard me that I'm very critical of Evo Morales' government, but there are some things that are good, and I think that one is one important thing, to see a different elite, to see different people on government, to see different faces, different. We don't use the word race, but ethnicities in Congress, for example. Many people think that all those congressmen that are Aymaras or Quechuas don't really play an important role. They are like, they're like very functional to what the president wants, and it's also true. But it is a job that we have to make, and it's long. It's really long. Racism is entrenched, and goes from one generation to another. But addressing it, I think, is the best. the approval of the president and the opposition, the approval of the president in Bolivia is going down. His popularity is going down, and he can lose an election. And but the opposition is divided. So we are at this crossroads, and we could be. I am half optimistic, half pessimistic of what the outcome would be, and not to make the same mistakes that we made about Venezuela. What to do in Bolivia now? I think that stay alert. Bolivians have to be alert, and we have to keep fighting for a more democratic society. But also, what happened in Venezuela is also very challenging. And is it a foreign intervention, something that we should think of? I'm not sure. I really don't like to think that a foreign intervention is what is going to solve something. But then you see cases in the world where dictators are for decades in power because the international community didn't intervene. So what's the precise point where really we would need to have one kind of solution like that one? I don't think that Bolivia is in that point yet, and I think that Bolivians, of course, we need the help of the international community. As I said, the international community has to be informed, better informed than until now, and alert, and maybe we'll have this that Ronnie and I and many Bolivians want eagerly a change and a re-democratization of the country.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Raul and Ronald and every one of you for coming here today. I think we had a very lively discussion, informative, and we all learned something. And hopefully we leave also with a little bit of optimism that Raul is, rubbing on to all of us. So thank you very much for coming.